Okay, very good morning to you all. Thank you very much for joining us today at this public lecture held in cooperation with the Embassy of Japan to the Kingdom of Belgium and mission to NATO. Thank you very much for hosting us here in this beautiful central premises. We have a unique opportunity to discuss a topic that has been feeding our curiosity and anxiety, I would say, in the region, in Europe and globally, which is of the increasing build-up of the Chinese security posture and its implication for the regional and global security. I must say that in Europe, this is a topic that we have been kind of rediscovering. We talk about the European awakening to the China challenge, so to speak, which, to be fair, has really taken up much more vigor in the context of the war in Ukraine and of China's support of Russia and of the China-Russia rapprochement, which in a way has hit a raw nerve of the European public. It has triggered more awareness about the China challenge. It has triggered more sympathy towards our partners in the region. And it has triggered more concern towards the existing regional security hotspots. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce today the expert, perhaps one of the most knowledgeable experts on China in Japan, Professor Akio Takahara. Who perhaps you have all kind of come across the name or read some of his publications. He's extremely famous, popular in Japan and elsewhere. I will not go into big length of his impressive CV. You all read it in the invitation. Professor Akihara is currently Professor of Contemporary Chinese Politics at the School of Graduate School of Law and Politics at the University of Tokyo. Professor has an intimate experience with China as well. He was based in Hong Kong, he was based in Beijing, he taught at the University of Beijing, but of course has an impressive academic career internationally in the UK, in the US, in Japan, and in Australia. And of course is also advising and holding some policy-relevant positions today. So before I will pass the floor to the lecture itself and to Professor Takahara, I would like to also pass the microphone to our host, Ambassador Mikami, for a few words, and then we will move on.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you all to our Embassy's Information and Culture Center today. It is a great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Takahara, Akio Takahara. Professor Takahara is, as just has been introduced by Eva, a very famous scholar in Japan on China and international relations in East Asia. I myself have learned quite a lot from what Professor Takahara has written and has said. Myself, talking about China, I served in Beijing about 10 years ago when Mr. Xi Jinping became the leader of the Chinese Communist Party and People's Republic of China. After 10 years, now it seems Mr. Xi Jinping has immensely consolidated his power, and he just started his unprecedented third term as the leader of China. So we are very much interested in how Mr. Xi's new team will cope with various challenges, both inside and outside of China. And it's, of course, its huge impacts on the rest of the world. It so happens that President Xi Jinping is now visiting Moscow, meeting President Putin. And also, it so happens that our Prime Minister Kishida is now in Ukraine to meet President Zelensky. So this is a very exciting time, and diplomacy is moving very fast. I hope that I think that there may not be a better timing and speaker to talk about China than Mr. Takahara today at this seminar. I hope you will enjoy it. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Takahara to make the presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, good morning, bonjour, ohayou gozaimasu, and zao shan hao. It's such a pleasure to be here with you this morning in Brussels. I'm actually following Ambassador Mikami in the sense that I visited him in Phnom Penh, Cambodia in December, and I'm so happy to see him here. He was an immensely popular ambassador in Phnom Penh. Not only amongst the Japanese people living in Cambodia, but also amongst the government and otherwise other people in Cambodia. So I hope he will stay here for long so that he can serve the interests of all the people who are in Belgium and even outside. So I would like to thank not only Ambassador Mikami and the Japanese Embassy, but also the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy of the Brussels School of Governance. I'm looking at this so that I won't make a mistake. And my friend Dr. Eva Pechova from Paris, who are here from Paris. I heard that it's only an hour's ride on a train, but I am so thankful for her moderation this morning. If I may start the slides, can you switch it on? Can you hear me? Is this microphone working? Okay, merci beaucoup. So the topic is trends in China's posture, implications for Japan and beyond. Let me start. I don't think we have a lot of time today, or I have a lot of things to say, so I must try not to speak for too long. I aim for 30 minutes or even shorter so that we can have a lot of Q&A. Okay, all right? First of all, I would like to look into the domestic politics of China because it has a lot to do with their foreign policy making. I would like to point out first that the top priority of the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping, the leader of it, is to maintain the regime. And one weakness that is understood by Mr. Xi and his colleagues is the lack of legitimacy to rule because they're not elected by the ordinary people. And they find this a problem. They read about legitimacy, not only Mr. Xi himself, but also the previous vice president of the PRC was a man called Wang Qishan, who was an avid reader, and he read a lot about legitimacy, which shows that they are concerned about the lack of legitimacy to rule. So Xi Jinping often talks about the color revolution. The fear of the color revolution is always in his mind, that one day the people will revolt against him and topple the government that is organized by the CCP. The problem is, I tend to see there are two axes in Chinese politics. One axis is a horizontal one. And here, as you all know, Xi Jinping has dominated the scene. That is, in terms of power politics, in terms of high-level politics, now Xi Jinping dominates. That's no problem for him, at least for the moment. But when it comes to the vertical axis, then there are a lot of problems. That is the relationship between the party and the masses, or between Mr. Xi Jinping and the ordinary people. Especially last year, because of the very tight zero COVID policy that China was first pursuing, as you know, very forceful lockdowns, limitations of people's movements and so on and so forth, people suffered. The economy suffered. And what happened was the Omicron came, and this very tight control over people's movements were no longer possible. It was no longer possible for the government to pursue. So that was one reason why Xi Jinping suddenly cancelled the zero COVID policy. And the second one was the economic downturn, the economic plight that the tight zero COVID policy was bringing about. And thirdly, the protests that arose from the people. The student who held the white blank sheet of paper, that was first occurring in campuses, but then it went out of the campuses, and some citizens joined also, shouting, Xi Jinping should step down. And those three factors, I think, contributed to the change in policy that came very suddenly and caused a lot of deaths, unfortunately. We don't even know the exact number of deaths caused by the sudden cancellation of the zero COVID policy, but people started to realize that maybe there's something wrong in the system. First, when the COVID-19 broke out in early 2020, people were quite worried about the one-party rule system. But then Xi Jinping tried very hard to fight back. He did three things. One was to contain the virus. The second was to implement a very thorough propaganda campaign to promote his image, to recover his image, and he was very successful there. And thirdly, he tried to recover the economy, and he was able to pull Chinese economy out of the plight much quicker than countries in Europe and in North America. And he was able to point to President Trump in the United States then, and the democracies in Europe, which seemed to be failing to control the virus compared to how well Xi Jinping had been able to contain the viruses in 2020 and 2021. And people seemed to be convinced that the one-party rule had its advantages when it comes to bringing about the stability and economic prosperity for the people. But last year's developments shook this belief, and people are now questioning whether China will be able to maintain its economic growth and its social stability in the years to come. Okay? What is Xi Jinping's methodology, however, to bring about the stability in society? It's all right to bring about stability. No one will complain about that. It's a good thing. However, the problem lies in his methodology, I would say. The center of his methodology is to implement homogenization, to homogenize the whole society. In Xinjiang, the policy for stability is homogenization. In Hong Kong, the policy was forceful homogenization, wasn't it? And now, even amongst the Politburo, it's homogenization again. So all the members of the Politburo, the Standing Committee, there are Xi Jinping's men, not from other political groupings. So this may be effective in bringing about short-term stability, but what about long-term stability? Isn't it rather diversity and inclusion that will bring about long-term stability of society or any organization? I think that's the case. So this short-term stability that he has forcefully brought about, I think, can be shaken in the future. And in relation to diplomacy or external policies, one issue is his identity, Xi Jinping's identity. It is often said that Chairman Mao, the founder of the PRC, made the Chinese people stand up, right? And Deng Xiaoping, the leader in the 1980s, he was a man who made the Chinese people rich. And Xi Jinping finds himself as a leader who made China very powerful, strong. And this is problematic for the countries outside China. So the paradigm, let me touch on this. The paradigm that the value system now that's prevalent in China is to enrich the nation and enrich the people and strengthen the country. The Japanese are familiar with this because this was a slogan that the Japanese government had after the Meiji Restoration in 1868 to catch up with the West. The task then diplomatically was to revise the unequal treaties that Japan was forced to sign with the imperial powers of that time. So in order to catch up, to quickly modernize, the policy or the paradigm was to enrich the people and strengthen the military. So we kind of understand that China is going through this rapid modernization process. This is the paradigm that they have adopted. And this causes anti-Western sentiments. Why? Because rapid modernization, in the process, you have to import a lot of Europe, a lot of Western things into your society. Not only you change the way you wear clothes, but also a lot of institutions are brought in to facilitate the modernization of your country. And this causes friction with the tradition in your societies. You get worried, how much tradition do we have to change, do we have to lose? And anti-Western sentiments easily aroused out of that situation. Okay? So nationalism becomes rife. And 1 week after the Hague International Arbitral Tribunal's ruling came out on the 12th of July 2016, exactly 1 week after that, somebody said, the Chinese nation's energy has been suppressed for too long. Let it explode and realize the China dream. Of course, it's Xi Jinping who said that. Well, he didn't say this directly to the military. He didn't say this to the Coast Guards, but actually he was trying to encourage workers in one factory in inland China that he was visiting. But the terminology he used was a very nationalistic one. And these words get sent down to a lot of different sectors and departments. And of course, it went down to the Navy and the Coast Guards and the fishing department also, perhaps. And some people may have thought that, okay, the leader, the boss is saying this, so let us explode our nationalistic sentiments. And these words could lead to actions by different departments under the government. Now, as Ambassador Mikami told us, Xi Jinping is in Moscow now. We are watching very carefully what he has to say. But if we look back a year ago when the crisis began, 1 day after the invasion, that's the 25th of February, Xi Jinping and Putin had a phone conversation. And according to the Russians, the Russian version of the content of the conversation and the Chinese version are different. But according to the Russians, Xi Jinping emphasized that he respected the action taken by the Russian leader under the current critical situation. A very blunt approval and endorsement of the action by Putin. And 4 months later, on the 15th of June, do you know what day that is? If you do, you are a real China expert. The 15th of June is Xi Jinping's birthday. And Putin and Xi Jinping makes it a rule to have a conversation on that day. And in that conversation, according to the Russians, the president of China noted the legitimacy of Russia's actions. So once again, an approval, an endorsement was given. Why does Xi Jinping support Putin? Well, it's quite obvious, isn't it? The big reason is because Xi Jinping finds the strategic competition with the US a paramount task to win. And in order to win this competition, he needs Russia as the most important partner in the competition with the US. And it turns out that the worldviews of Xi Jinping and Putin are quite similar, quite similar. They tend to think that democracies have failed because democracies give too much rights to people, the refugees, like the refugees or the LGBTQ, and this leads to internal divisions, internal fighting, and as a result, the US-led international order is in crisis, is going through a crisis. And now it's China and Russia's turn, because we have traditional values. We don't like refugees, we don't like the LGBTQ. So we can lead the new order at this moment. Those are the worldviews, roughly speaking, held both by Mr. Xi and Mr. Putin. But at the same time, they know that their legitimacy to rule is questionable. So they are both aware of the risk of the color revolution. I tend to call it the Russification of Chinese diplomacy, because I think in Russia, it's been like this for some time, that whenever they see anything happening in the world, they see the United States behind it. Yeah? Nowadays, China, when it looks at Ukraine, they see the United States behind it. When they talk to the Canadians, they see the United States behind it. When they talk to the Hungarians, or whoever, the Japanese, they see the United States behind it. So they always tell us that, oh, the Japan is doing this again because you want to please the Americans. Come on. That's not the case. We are genuinely angry that you are actively acting in the East China Sea, especially around the Senkakus or the Diaoyu, that's how the Chinese call it. And it's got nothing to do with the United States, as far as we are concerned. I've been having a lot of conversations with people coming to Tokyo from all over the world, and they all say the same thing. They are frustrated that nowadays, whenever they talk to the Chinese, the Chinese are actually talking to the Americans, not to us. That's the current situation. Okay? But I noticed that in mid-September last year, the phase changed a little bit because of listening to these remarks by Mr. Putin. We all got that impression, didn't we, when on the 15th of September, Xi Jinping met in person Mr. Putin in Samarkand, Uzbekistan, and Putin was forced to say, that's the impression that we got, Putin was forced to say in front of the TV cameras rolling that we appreciate our friend's balanced position in connection with the Ukraine crisis. We understand your questions and your concerns in this regard. But you see how he said it. He wasn't smiling. He didn't look happy at all saying this. This was a bit of a surprise to hear Putin say these words, because it was just 6 days before that Xi Jinping's good friend, old friend, then number 3 in the CCP lineup, Mr. Li Jianshu, who used to be the chairperson of the National People's Congress, when he visited Moscow on the 9th of September, he was meeting his counterpart in the Duma, the lower house of the federal parliament. According to the Russians, Mr. Li Jianshu said this: China understands and supports Russia on issues that represent its vital interests, in particular on the situation in Ukraine. We are providing our assistance. And apparently, the Chinese were not happy that the Russians revealed this remark. And 6 days later, Putin's remarks told us that Xi Jinping shifted his position a little bit. He walked backwards, as it were. And why was that? Possible factors include the following. Firstly, the change in the war situation. If you remember, in mid-September, we were observing the Ukrainian forces fighting back, pushing back against the Russians. So that could have been one important factor. Second, there was a big debate going on in China. Perhaps it's going on today also. There are people who oppose Xi Jinping's position about the Russian invasion into Ukraine. Many people actually spoke publicly, academics and former diplomats. They said that we should not support Russia. Russia is doomed. Even if Russia won the immediate battle, in a few years' time, they're destined to fail. And we should be on the side of the mainstream of the world. Some people even said that. So they acknowledge, some people in China acknowledge that the mainstream consists of Europe, America, and Japan, and the rest. So if you remember, the Chinese had a big political event last year in October. Once in 5 years, they have the party congress. And this was the time when all the dealings were going on. And perhaps Xi Jinping may have thought that he needed to compromise a little bit on this front to win something else domestically. The third factor is China's economic plight. Chinese economic downturn is real. The Chinese cannot find a new engine for growth. And you know how high the unemployment rate is in China today, especially amongst the youths. The official published figure is over 17%. The most recent announcement in February this year was 18.1% for the age bracket from 16 to 24. So in that kind of a situation, Xi Jinping and his friends and his colleagues very much like to fix their relations with the United States, Europe, and Japan. So perhaps in order to lure the Europeans in particular, who find China's relations with Russia such an important topic, Xi Jinping wanted to show to the world that he was shifting his position as of mid-September. And if you remember, in early November, Chancellor Scholz visited Beijing with a bunch of CEOs of the leading German companies. And then, for the first time, Xi Jinping said in public that he's against the use of nuclear weapons. So we can see that the Ukraine war is a card when Xi Jinping wants to deal with the Europeans. Okay? And also there are basic differences between Russia and China. Putin is so frustrated that he's treated as a loser in the Cold War, or he has a lot of resentment and nationalism. He thinks Ukraine and Russia should be the same, one and the same. But this contrasts with the Chinese realism and its aspiration to become a superpower. Russia is descending, China is ascending. These are the very basic differences between the two countries. And I think from the Chinese realistic point of view, they couldn't believe that Putin actually invaded Ukraine. A lot of the Chinese commentators who appear on official media were saying that it's all false story, it's a fake story. Americans are shouting that Russia's going to invade Ukraine, but it's not going to happen. That was the voice that was coming out from China just before the war. And Xi Jinping visits Moscow. Are we going into the third phase in China's policy towards Russia? We're not sure yet, but it could reflect some recent changes in the aforementioned factors. For example, the war situation. The Russians are holding and pushing back a little bit. That's what we hear in the news. But in any case, Xi Jinping must conduct a very, very difficult balancing act, because he knows he has to uphold his partnership with Putin. He doesn't want Russia to get a big damage out of this war, because he needs Russia in the primary task of winning the competition with the US. But on the other hand, he needs to stabilize and possibly improve relations with the United States at this moment, and also with Europe, also with Japan. So can he achieve these two things at the same time? Very difficult, I would say, but let's see what will come out of the meeting between Xi and Putin this time. Some people worry about Taiwan. Now the invasion happened in Ukraine. Will it happen in Taiwan also? And some people think that Xi Jinping's recent remarks on Taiwan are very hardline, but I would say not really. I mean, I cannot detect any change in China's policy over Taiwan. And not only me, but some experts on Taiwan in Japan think that we cannot rule out 100% that invasion will not happen, but at least it's unlikely that it will happen in the near future. And my reason is very simple. It's because, as I said at the outset, Xi Jinping's top priority is to protect his regime. Now, invading Taiwan at this moment is too risky for this purpose. And in the future, if he gets very pressurized internally and thinks that invading Taiwan actually helps him maintain his regime, he will invade. But I don't think that day will come very soon. So that's my take on Taiwan. Do I have a little more time? Thank you. So that's on Ukraine and Taiwan. And more generally, the Chinese actions these days are causing anxiety here and there, not only in the neighborhood of China, but also in other parts of the world too. But when we look at their policies, their policy documents, what's written are very soft, very gentle, very moderate, and aiming for peace, but their actions are quite different. So there is a big gap between their words and their deeds. But why is that? I think the basic reason is they're acting since now they have the ability to act. They were not able to make maritime advancements in the past, but now they have the ability to do so. So let's do it. They are believers in power. They're believers in money. Now we have the power and the money, so let's do what we were not able to do before. That's a basic position. And secondly, I must point out that they say otherwise, but in fact they don't have a great respect for rules. When we think about how the internal order is supported inside China, we find that there's no rule of law in the sense that we understand the term. But order is supported by the outstanding power of the Chinese Communist Party, right? So I call it Pax Communista. And for some people who envisage a Pax Sinica outside of China, in the region and beyond, it's likely, judging from what they've been doing in the region, it's just an extension of Pax Communista. And that won't be welcomed at all by the neighbors. And they get criticisms. Chinese receive criticisms from the outside world for their actions, but they don't really care. Now we are big, now we are powerful. So eventually they will bend their knees. And a little criticism is actually helpful in order to unite the nation, because Xi Jinping is worried about that people won't support him anymore. So when we think about the high heat of nationalism that exists in China, some criticisms from outside actually helps to unite and maintain people's support to the regime. So the wolf warriors are very clear about this. Famous wolf warrior in France, Ambassador Lu, he said it very openly, I think a couple of years ago, that we judge our work not by what foreigners say, but by what our people think about us. So the diplomats are are facing not their counterpart colleagues in other countries, but are facing their people. Oh, that's dangerous, I would say. But that's the reality at the moment. Xi Jinping's propensity to act could be another factor. I've already touched on that. And I would then add problems in China's self-perception. Oops, this is the record of the number of boats coming into the territorial sea and contiguous zones around the Senkaku Islands, or what the Chinese call Diaoyu. But I'm going to skip this. Defense budget, I'm going to skip this. The Chinese defense budget is increasing very rapidly. And 3 years ago, it was 4 times the size of Japan's. Now, it's 5 times the size of the Japanese defense budget. So the Japanese government has decided to increase our budget quickly by the standards of Japan, but we, of course, won't catch up with the increase in the Chinese defense budget. Oops, sorry. I was talking about the self-perception issue. I can give you a few examples. One is the Chinese government calls its neighborhood diplomacy peripheral diplomacy. This is the official translation. So I tell my Chinese friends, you should not say this. And no one, when I said that, no one could understand what I was talking about. Why can't we say peripheral diplomacy? And I point out to them that, well, if you say your neighborhood diplomacy, peripheral diplomacy, you are implying that you are the center. and they go, wow, oh, you're right. We didn't realize that, so we should change the name. But it's still peripheral diplomacy to this day. Another example, Mr. Xi is very fond of talking about the DNA of the Chinese nation. He often quotes this in his remarks. The blood of the Chinese nation does not contain the DNA to invade others and become a hegemon. Ooh, don't say this in front of a Vietnamese friend or a Korean friend. And the late Premier Zhou Enlai, if you remember, was more honest. And he told Henry Kissinger, well, we have invaded Korea, we have invaded Vietnam, but Xi Jinping has forgotten that bit of history. And after repeating this phrase, apparently he believes in it, you know? And a lot of the Chinese people believe in it now too, and that's dangerous. So a final example, Zheng He, the great admiral in the early 15th century in the Ming Dynasty. You know, he led this huge fleet visiting not only Southeast Asia, South Asia, but even to Africa. He made many, many voyages, you know, a fantastic achievement, I would say, in the early 15th century. And now he's a symbol of China's peaceful maritime advancement. The Chinese say that Zheng He is very different from the European barbarous colonizers. You know, Zheng He did not colonize any piece of land. Zheng He did not make any locals slaves. Look how different Zheng He was from the imperial colonizers later. But I visited a national museum in Sri Lanka, Colombo, and saw a display saying, "We were invaded by Zheng He." Oh, I had never heard about that. So there was not much explanation under the display, so I had to go home and check. And apparently it's because there were a few kingdoms on the island of Ceylon at that time, and one king refused to join the tributary system, which was the request by Zheng He. Zheng He got very angry, attacked the kingdom, captured the king and his family, and sent them back to China, sent them down to China. So for the Sri Lankans, Zheng He was an invader. And the story exists in other parts of Asia too, like in Java. But when I say this, my Chinese friends don't believe me. They say, Akio Takahara doesn't understand his history correctly. Oh, I'm sorry, but I'm just listening to the historians. And as a result, this is a symbolic, typical view expressed in this case by the elite in ASEAN. The Yusof Ishak Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore have been doing a fantastic job in the past few years. Every year they publish the result of the survey they conduct among the elite in ASEAN. They ask which country is the most influential economic power in Southeast Asia, and around 80% of the people answer it's China. But then when that 80% is asked, what do you think about it? Over 70% of the people answer they're worried. And the Chinese have realized this issue. So they want to do better to improve their image in Southeast Asia. But if they don't change their deeds, their actions, then I don't think the basic situation will change. But this shows our trade, Japan's trade with China and the US. The trade with China is in the red. The trade with the US is in the blue. And you can see how important China has become as our economic partner, as our trading partner. Number one trading partner is China for Japan. Number two is the United States. Number three is the EU. But if we put the US and EU together, it's just above the trade that we have with China. So you can understand how big China is economically, right? So as a result, we have no choice. We have to pursue a two-pronged approach. That is to compete and cooperate at the same time. We have to stand firm against Chinese physical challenges, its maritime advancement, its attempts to change the status quo by physical force. You see here how often the Chinese Coast Guards are sending their vessels to the vicinity of the Senkakus. Before there were none, you know. And they seized the opportunity in 2012 when the Japanese government purchased 3 islands from a Japanese private landlord. That was to stabilize the situation, but the Chinese seized that opportunity and started to send the boats in a big way, and we don't like that. This is against the promises, many promises that Japan and China have made, that we should not use force or the threat of force to solve these disagreements. All right. and therefore, we have to increase the defense budget, and we have to reinforce our alliance with the US, we have to reinforce our partnership with the EU, etc. But on the other hand, if we only did that, that's lopsided. So we have to try and have dialogues, also continue cooperating. You know, Japan and China are not bickering every day. And we do a lot of cooperation on a daily basis. We do the joint anti-piracy operation off the coast of Somalia. And in many months, the largest number of foreign vessels that the Japanese self-defense forces protect are the Chinese vessels. Environmental protection, sanitation, you know, anti-pandemic, what have you. So we have to keep on seeking cooperation. And I would say that even between the Belt and Road Initiative, we can coexist. We have our free and open Indo-Pacific, the FOIP, they have their BRI, and they can coexist. I think I should end very soon, but just a brief explanation of what I mean. I don't think anybody can define BRI very clearly. I have never seen a very clear definition presented by the Chinese government. They only say under BRI we can do this, we can do that, etc. And I tend to liken the BRI to a constellation. That's the word that's written in bright yellow. I deliberately wrote it in bright yellow so that it's difficult for you to read. Because constellations, who's ever seen a constellation? I don't think anybody has seen it, because it doesn't exist, right? What exists are the stars. But Xi Jinping is pointing at the sky. Look at all the stars. You see a dragon there. That's the Belt and Road Initiative. And we go, wow. And our eyes are glittering with renminbi. Yes? So if I am forced to define it, it's a symbol of Xi Jinping's authority and power in the world. The Chinese are genius. They are so good at inventing these constellations, like reform and opening. Reform and opening, who can define it very clearly? Nobody. If you say it's a bunch of reform policies, then you cannot say reform and opening began in 1978, because reform policies were negated at the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee, which is now said to be the starting point of reform and opening. No reforms there. Reforms were actually negated. But still, the narrative goes that under Deng Xiaoping, reform and opening started in 1978, and the world now believes in that. But that's not true. It depends on the definition. If you define reform and opening as a symbol of Deng Xiaoping's authority and power, the narrative, you can understand the Chinese Communist Party narrative better. Yes, okay, you want to say it started in 1978. That's how you want to put it. I think that's the way we should understand these constellations. And FOIP is actually another constellation, isn't it? But we should pay attention to the stars, the project. And Mr. Abe, the late Prime Minister Abe, said it very clearly in 2017. We are willing to cooperate with the BRI if the projects met certain conditions: openness, transparency, economic viability, and the fiscal soundness of the recipient nation, you know, no debt trap or things like that. If these conditions are met, Japan is willing to cooperate with the BRI. And the Chinese, these days, when they criticize FOIP, the way they criticize it is they criticize the American free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. They don't criticize the Japanese version of FOIP. So they're leaving room for cooperation with the Japanese in the future. It's a very interesting point that many people overlook. A very final. So we are facing a big challenge because the two-pronged approach is contradictory, isn't it? If you cooperate, you're making China bigger, stronger, more powerful. So the competition becomes tougher. So if you are a security expert, you don't want any cooperation. But if you are a business person, you don't want competition, you only want cooperation. So the leader has to have a very solid and wide power base. Abe could do it because under Abe's wings, there were both hawks and the doves. They were both those who pay attention, a lot of attention to security issues, and those who pay attention to businesses, to economic interests. So this is the same situation in any country, including China. China has to cooperate and compete at the same time. But can the leader have that wide and solid power base to implement these contradictory things together is a challenge. And it's an increasingly large challenge because the competition will intensify. Yeah? And cooperation will harden and deepen. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think you all think the same, I hope. This was absolutely fascinating. It is most useful to get an internal view. I call it a psychology session, if you want to really try to read China, to zoom into the identity issues, to zoom into history, to zoom into the ego politics behind and the domestic issues is absolutely necessary to get to read anything that China is doing. I will now invite you to think of your questions as we perhaps put the seats, if that's okay, to make... and while you think of your question, I'll abuse my power, because frankly, I have many, many questions. But what I think was extremely useful in what you said is the rationale behind Xi Jinping's thinking. We do understand it is a quest of legitimacy. We do understand the kind of internal, external dynamic. But the misperception is, of course, the most dangerous part, how it will be read from the outside and where would be the red lines. And if we zoom into the Russia-China relationship, for instance, there's a lot of debate to the degree of trust, of course, between the two, marriage of convenience, all has been there. In Europe, we hear a lot of skepticism towards the sustainability of this relationship because Russia doesn't do junior partners, because it's only willing, because it destroys China's international image. So what would be the Chinese, I know you already did explain quite a bit, and we cannot read the future, we don't know what Xi Jinping will be discussing in Moscow, of course. But if we consider that, let's say, prosperity and wealth, economic prosperity, is really the key for the population, then China, of course, would have more interest, not only image-wise, but to kind of re-engage in the West to keep steering the machine, right? Because there are a lot of problems. It's demography, it's health, it's not just COVID, it's really the kind of painful part would be the domestic part. Is there a genuine support? I mean, what would be the public kind of opinion towards Russia, or where would the public lead? What would be the most dangerous part, where this upheaval can come from, if that's a question?
Thank you. When was that? 7, 8 years ago, when I last lived in Beijing for about half a year, I had a conversation with several think tank guys in China. But the conversation topic was, what could trigger a systemic change in China? And we said, oh, an economic crisis. No authoritarian regime in the past has survived actually a big economic crisis. We said perhaps 2 years of a bad crop in a row. As a Japanese, I said perhaps a huge earthquake hitting Beijing or Shanghai, like in 1976, or even more directly hitting Beijing or Shanghai. And one senior person said, well, yeah, these could be factors, but there's another one. And I asked him, what is it? And he said, an epidemic. This was after SARS in 2003 and 2004. And I think, therefore, in 2020, when Xi Jinping was faced with COVID-19, it was really a critical time for him to do his best to control the virus. But that's because, it's not only directly about human lives, but the economic conditions are deeply affected by a pandemic eventually. And he knows, because Deng Xiaoping said it very clearly in 1992, after the failure of the Soviet Union and the East European socialist nations, that Deng Xiaoping said they failed because they failed in economic policies. And Deng Xiaoping's argument then was that, therefore, we have to forcefully pursue reform and opening policies so that people's support to us will not change. So I think the conditions that we discussed 7, 8 years ago in Beijing are still there. If another pandemic comes, how is Xi Jinping going to deal with it? Will he impose this very tight zero COVID style policy again or not? I don't think that's going to work. But then what is the better way to handle it? And if an economic crisis comes, if a big earthquake hits, if these bad crops come in 2 years or 3 years in a row, all these haunt the minds of the leaders in China.
Thank you very much. Or all that in one, for instance. Please don't be shy. You have about 30 minutes to pick on Professor Takahara's wisdom. Okay.
Yeah, many thanks for your very interesting presentation. My name is Reinhold Brender. I'm a former EU official. I held responsibilities for Japan in the EU system. Now, I have two questions. The first is a question about your statement that essentially President Xi has a self-imposed identity. He's the man who made China strong, you said. This is how he wants to be seen. Yes. And there is a direct link with his legitimacy, you also implied. Now, my first question refers to what you said about Taiwan. I think I see a little bit of a contradiction, because you said with regard to Taiwan, you indicated you do not immediately see a risk. But I wanted to ask you, if you look ahead, isn't there a risk in the sense that unavoidably there must be a risk, because Taiwan is such a high priority for China's national identity? So I can't square the two elements you point out, this non-risk, which you see at least for the foreseeable future, if I understand you correctly, on the one hand, and on the other, the strong statement, and I think it's a very valid statement, that there is indeed a self-imposed identity. The second question I want to raise refers a little bit to the Japan's new security strategy. And there is also a reference, a brief one. I was a bit surprised, there are different elements which are being pursued by this strategy. It's about making Japan strong. It is also about working with partners, rightly so, I would think. And my question there is, Japan is now holding the G7 presidency, and we have soon a G20 presidency coming up where India is in the chair. My question is, what is Japan's role basically at this point? How do you see it in working with others, not just with the like-minded, and not just with ASEAN, where there are some like-minded as well, but also with the broader rest, with the global south notably? Is there a chance, and I would find this very important, that Japan, like others, like hopefully also the EU, will really make an effort to work with all the countries that at this point are not fully supportive of what we call the rules-based international order? Thank you.
I am Ludovica, actually a PhD student at CSDS. And my question for you is if you are aware of any instance where China has used maritime cooperation with Japan in a transactional way, or it doesn't have to be maritime cooperation, it can be anything, like it has done in the past with climate change. For instance, saying to the US that it cannot expect cooperation on certain topics if political relations get sour between the two countries. If you're aware of this dynamic happening in China-Japan relations as well.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Daniel. I'm a master's student at the Brussels School of Governance. Thank you for this presentation, it was really interesting. My question to you is, in scholarly debates and other commentaries, we hear that many are saying that China is reaching a plateau of its economic or power growth, or both of them. Do you agree with these assessments? And do you think, if that is it worrying because China might have to take in other assertive means to reach its promises and policy goals that they have, if that would be the case? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the great questions. The first one is on Taiwan. You know, it's very interesting that in the days of Chairman Mao, the People's Liberation Army was almost going to cross the strait and liberalize Taiwan. But that didn't happen because of the Korean War. Since the Korean War broke out, the Americans changed their policy and intervened in between Taiwan and mainland China. But then, at times, Chairman Mao did conduct some operations, military operations, targeting Taiwan, like firing these cannons across the straits. There are small islands that Taiwan possesses off the coast of mainland China. But that stopped, and Chairman Mao said that it's okay. We don't have to unite with Taiwan immediately or very soon. Why is that? Because if Taiwan lies out there, that will help us unite with us, you know, get together. So once Taiwan becomes part of the PRC, let's assume that happening, then there's no good target to arouse nationalistic sentiments amongst the people. I think that's what Chairman Mao meant. It's a very interesting way of understanding this contradiction, as it were. So I don't think Xi Jinping is very desperate now. It's not his top priority to unify with Taiwan at this moment. His top priority is to stabilize society, find a new engine of growth so that he'll be supported by the people. And that's a bigger challenge to him at the moment. Taiwan, unless, of course, it's very different if Taiwan changes its policy and begins to move towards independence. And if the new president, who will be elected next year, if he or she becomes more orientated towards independence, then Xi Jinping must think otherwise. But unless that happens, I don't think Taiwan will be the top priority for him. The next question about how Japan will play the role of the chairmanship of the G7 is a very important one, and we've been thinking about a lot. And in my view, I think what we should promote is human security. You know, we are trying to revive the importance, to remember the importance of the concept of human security. Human security, many people don't understand it well, but it's quite simple. It is to preserve people's lives, people's livelihoods, and dignity. These three things: lives, livelihoods, and dignity. And in this divided world of today, I think it's no use to use the banner of universal values. Universal values put people off. Many people in the so-called global south think that the Western world is forcing these universal values on them and easily criticize those countries for not implementing these universal values. They think they are Western values, not universal values. So I think we should go back to the starting point, as it were, you know, that we are all humans and we all find our lives, our livelihoods and dignity very important. And therefore, Japan will, I think, hold high this banner of human security and use it as a flag under which all the peoples can unite. But in order to realize the preservation of people's lives, livelihoods, and dignity, of course, more concrete measures have to be considered. How we can protect these people in trouble, how we can empower those people who are in trouble, and how we can enhance the resilience of societies and communities. And how I would add that we need a mechanism to stop the abuse of power by the power holders, both internally and internationally. And for this, if we can't do that, people's dignity, people's lives and livelihoods can easily be destroyed, as we see happening in Ukraine today. So internationally, but also internally. Now there's a lot of violent extremism in many countries that we are unable to prevent. So these, the banner, the flag of human security, I think, is one measure or one thing that we should hold up high to unite with the global south. That's how I feel. In the third issue, if there are any examples in which China has used this cooperation card, as it were, to achieve their, what they want to achieve. I can't think of, can you think of any yourself?
Other than the climate change instance, no. But I was just wondering if it's a pattern that it somehow, I mean, China does it not on the cooperation side, but more on like access to market, like just the weaponization of economic measures to achieve political gains.
You know, I can't come up with any examples myself, but for example, in the South China Sea, China and the Southeast Asian nations that are involved have been spending years to come up with the code of conduct there. And it's China that's the stumbling block. So China may use this in some way. You know, we are going to relent on this, so we want this or that. That could happen, but I don't see that happening myself. So, yeah. But thank you. It was an interesting question. Okay. About the Chinese economic power coming to a plateau, yes, if this situation continues, or you know, there's a likelihood that the economic downturn will proceed for even further, and then what's going to happen? Many people worry about diversionary diplomacy. So the leadership will try to divert people's attention to something else, perhaps friction with an external country. And therefore, the Indians and the Vietnamese are very worried about this now. You know, so possible targets could be, one is Taiwan. People think about Taiwan, or the Philippines now. But I think the likelihood is higher for India and Vietnam. Why? Because if you are against Taiwan and the Philippines, you have to fight with the United States. And the Chinese are very practical people. I don't think they want to do that at this point.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Akio Takahara, for this presentation. It was very enlightening and very important. My name is Amy Assini. I am an executive assistant at the Institute for Economics and Peace. And I'm also a master's student at the Brussels School of International Studies. And I would like to ask you, as you have mentioned already in your presentation, there has been a significant increase in the expenditure of China's military capabilities. And also we see an increase in assertiveness in the East China Sea for the Senkaku Islands, but also particularly in the South China Sea, particularly the Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands. And what I would like to ask you is, how is Japan, let's say, partnering or negotiating with the Southeast Asian countries in order to diversify their security capabilities, while also trying to uphold freedom of navigation operations and the general concept of international territory in terms of the Pacific, international, the concept of territorial waters in general. Again, what is Japan doing to strengthen these ties, these bilateral or multilateral ties with Southeast Asian allies? Thank you.
That perhaps we could come to.
My name is Wolfgang Pape, former EU official and now still working with the CEPS, the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels. I appreciated very much your information, but I have one question which seems to be open. You mentioned anti-Western sentiment being a common denominator for the two, Russia and China. I wonder how far this can be crystallized on the issue of NATO expansion. was in the 90s when even Baker, he's head of the State Department in the US, and Genscher in Europe were against NATO expansion, and some others as well, in NGOs, of course. How far this has brought them together as well, and this seems to be now with Ukraine very much a common sentiment. It's not anti-Western, it's anti-NATO in my understanding. And I would say the West is not West anymore. Westlessness was a new word coined by a security conference in Munich at the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for your interesting presentation. I'm Yang Li from Institute of China-Europe Studies. My question is about rules. So I think one of the contending points between China and the Western countries, including Japan, is about the rules. And China is blamed to disrespecting international rules. So that, can you tell us from your point of view, so what is at the bottom, at the nature of this difference?
Nature of?
The nature of this difference are the rules.
Difference.
Okay. So China, rest of the world, upholding different set of rules, or it is only their different interpretation of the same set of rules. So is there any way for both sides to bridge these differences, to turn it from a contending point into a kind of connecting point? So that's my question. Thank you.
Japan and Southeast Asia. This is a very interesting, important topic. If you remember, in the 1970s, there were a lot of demonstrations in Southeast Asian countries against Japan for their so-called economic invasion. And in the latter part of the 1970s, we came up with what's called the Fukuda Doctrine, promising that Japan will never become a military power. We want to develop a heart-to-heart relationship. We support ASEAN's development. These were the three pillars of the Fukuda Doctrine. And it succeeded. Thankfully, the Southeast Asian nations, I would say in most of them, perhaps all of them, the anti-Japanese sentiment has come down, and a lot of the people have a very positive image of Japan nowadays. With China's maritime advancement, many countries are looking at Japan, hoping that Japan will do more to support those countries. But we have our constitutional limitations. So what we have been doing is to what we call help their capacity building, especially regarding their coast guards. That's a lot. That's an area that we do a lot to help their capacity building. Now we have a new arrangement with the Philippines, making it easier for the two militaries to visit each other. So gradually, I think that kind of an arrangement could be extended to other nations too. But at the moment, militarily, there's not much that Japan can do. In the future, perhaps arms sales were not possible either under the original interpretation of the Constitution. But now, gradually, the interpretation is being changed so that we'll be able to do those things. But we find our relations with Southeast Asia very important. I think one thing we should also do is to have more exchange between intellectuals, Japanese intellectuals and Southeast Asian intellectuals. We can talk anything, but especially policy studies, these discussions will be very helpful. Also, NATO expansion and anti-Western sentiments. I cannot respond very much to this. I haven't thought about it, to be honest. NATO has Turkey, so it's not quite EU, and whether anti-West and anti-NATO sentiments overlap completely with each other, I don't really know. I think I have to look into the specific cases where people are both anti-West and anti-NATO or not, at the same time. So I just don't have the enough knowledge to answer your question. I'm sorry about that. Rules. How can we treat the difference in the understanding of rules? I think our hope is very simple. we can understand that as a latecomer in rules making, China is not 100% happy about the existing rules in the world. So that's quite understandable. But when you want to change the rules, please use the rules to change them and not act against those rules. You know, if you don't like the rules in football, that's okay, but you just cannot do things that are against the rules on the pitch. You know, you have to change the rules outside. That's the hope that we have. But I think a lot of the scholars in China, international law experts who are trained overseas, their views are quite similar to our views, let's say. But they have grave difficulties when they go back to China because their views are not accepted by the mainstream of the Chinese academia.
I have a question about North Korea, because it's also in the middle of the game there. And do you think North Korea might cause in the near future a crisis in the area? And do you think North Korea plays a role in the Chinese strategy for the area?
Professor, my name is David Helby. I'm with the U.S. mission to NATO. Thank you very much for your lecture. In your earlier comments, you spoke to the contours of the China-Russia relationship. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your thoughts about some of the limitations of the China-Russia relationship.
My name is Willy van der Wal. I'm a professor of Japanese studies at the University of Leuven. We now know that the Chinese Navy is the biggest in the world, the Chinese Army as well, I suppose. Now we have AUKUS in recent years and months. We have this scheme set up by Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States to counterbalance the growth of the Chinese Navy, to build actually an integrated fleet of nuclear-powered submarines. But according to the planning, this is going to take a very long time. They become operational in the early 40s of this century. Now, what about parity? I think the parity is very important to determine whether there will be a flashpoint, yes or no. So do you have any ideas about projections of parity between the two sides, so let's say?
Thank you for the great questions again. North Korea is so enigmatic. Why can they build so many missiles under the sanctions that they're going through at the moment? It's really unimaginable. How can they? It's just a mystery, I would say. But there must be countries, there must be people helping. And there is always a possibility that they can disrupt the security environment directly. So we cannot lower our guard at any time against that. And we should always have in mind, like President Yoon of South Korea has mentioned, that if mainland China attack Taiwan, will North Korea attack South Korea? That is not a fantasy, I would say. So we should always keep in mind this thing called North Korea in our minds when we consider the security environment of East Asia in particular. Thank you. Limitations of China-Russia relations, a lot of limitations. You know, they say their partnership goes beyond the level of military alliances during the Cold War days. What do they mean? I don't think it means anything. They're just saying that. Russia has been trying to lure the Chinese army, PLA, into, for example, Syria, but not successful, because the Chinese are very pragmatic. They are very realistic. They know what they want. They know they know how to avoid any risks, any dangers, unnecessary risks for the Chinese national interest. And the Russians are always frustrated by that. But, and that leads us to think about another question, that is the non-existence of allies for China. The Chinese cannot trust any country. There were talks about striking an alliance with Russia when the NATO bomber hit their embassy in Belgrade in 1999. But still, I cannot foresee any possibility that one day China will have an alliance with Russia. Both countries, I mean, at least from the Chinese side, the Chinese don't trust the Russians. Had they been allies, what would have happened when Russia invaded Ukraine? I don't think China will want to be dragged into that kind of a situation. Yes, parity is going to be important in the future. When we talk about the need for managing the arms race, whether, when we think about a reduction in arms or control of arms buildup, I think a parity has to be established first in order for the weaker side to be serious in discussing these issues. But it's very difficult, I think, to calculate. I'm not a security expert, so I could be talking nonsense, but as an amateur observer, I think it's going to be very difficult to judge a parity because of all sorts of new ways to wage wars, new measures, a lot of technological developments have made the war a very complicated operation. So you can have equal numbers of ships, that's easy to see, but when it comes to things that you cannot see, how do you reach a parity? How do you judge that we have achieved the parity? So I think we are in very difficult days.
Thank you very much, Professor Takahara. My name is Hiroki Takabayashi. I'm the Minister of Embassy of Japan. I have one simple question. It's about the relationship between China and the US. How do you see the future course of the two countries' relationship?
I can talk a lot about my hopes. We all hope that the relationship will stabilize and we can lead a very comfortable life. But as I mentioned at the very end, it's very likely the competition will intensify in the near future unless there's a big systemic change in China. That would be a necessary condition for the intensified competition to settle down, I would say. And I didn't mention it perhaps, but a lot of the people in China, living in China today, don't think this regime is going to last forever. People's thinking or the social atmosphere can change very easily depending on the economic situation mainly. I remember when I lived in Beijing 2014 to 15, that was the last time, people were so pessimistic about the future. Most optimistic person said, it should be all right for another 20 years, but even I can say what will happen then. Pessimistic people said, we don't know what will happen tomorrow, because people were so unhappy about the way things were going, especially in the economy. The economic situation was very bad at that time. Still, the growth rate was higher, much higher than today, but still, people felt that anxiety. So we can just imagine how people are thinking today. Youngsters are so troubled by the insecurity that they feel, the uncertainty about the future of their country or society. So I had never heard this before, but nowadays Chinese students ask us, how can we become Japanese? How can we change our nationality? So you can sort of feel the level of anxiety that exists in the Chinese society today. But we don't know when the change will start. We don't know what the process is going to be. Chinese people worry that the process is not going to be a very peaceful one. But if turmoil happens, then we are all in trouble because now China is so big and important to everybody. What can we do? Not very much, perhaps, because we cannot shape China, but we can try and help the Chinese people change themselves. The Chinese people are changing every day, and a lot of the youngsters come overseas, very open-minded, very bright, clever. Those people understand that understand us, understand our values. But if you lived in China under the propaganda, then there's not much hope. So we should have more exchange with the Chinese people and be frank in what we think. And the reason, we should tell them the reason why we think this way. And we should try and understand why the Chinese think in their ways. And through that, I hope the shift will be a peaceful one, and eventually US-China relations will stabilize. But to think of it, we are, I think all of us are worried about the future of the United States, especially the next presidential election. So it's not only China, but we have to put our houses in order first. And that applies to Japan too. Sorry, I couldn't answer your question very clearly, but those were the thoughts that came to my mind listening to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, professors. And these were also the perfect words to conclude, I think, this session, because you point out on the kind of on communication and really openness and transparency to be the key to some of those standoffs. I mean, to overcome those misperceptions, and you need to do a bit of psychoanalysis, as you did with China, and also in oral our adversaries. So thank you so much. This was extremely enlightening. It was very comprehensive. I think we have a lot of food for thought also for our lunch breaks. I understand there is a light refreshment served just behind. So please use that opportunity to also discuss with each other and perhaps catch another glimpse of Professor Takahara. Thank you very much, and join me in thanking him.